And do we want to wait still a little bit, Dr. Thompson, or should we start? What do you think?
Well, my clock says 7 o'clock and I like to start on time, so we can start.
All right. So did you want to introduce, or does Kim want to, however you'd like to handle it?
I can bring greetings and then I can turn it over to whomever.
Great.
Why don't you turn it over to me,
Okay.
Madam President?
That sounds good. Okay, perfect. Okay. So good evening, everyone. I am Dr. Kenitha Thompson, President of the Inkster Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. And it is good to see so many familiar faces. And for those that are not familiar with me, welcome. It's good to see you as well. And we are excited that you are here to join us with our Social Action Committee as we have a conversation tonight about rebuilding our democracy. I think it's going to be a very good conversation, a good night, and I see a lot of people on here, so I'm looking forward to a lot of participation. And just looking forward, I appreciate this partnership, and I'm sure this is just the beginning of many more conversations to come. So I do appreciate that. And again, welcome everyone, and I'm going to turn it over to our chair, Kim Trent.
Thank you so much, Madam President. And I just want to thank everyone so much for joining us tonight. We know that the last few months, especially in the last several years, broadly have been challenging when we talk about civility. It's so important and so foundational to our democracy that we're able to have conversations just whether we agree with others or not. But what makes our democracy strong is not just our diversity as human beings from about where we came from and who we are and the color of our skin and our gender, but our points of view as well. And so we really thought it was important to have a series of conversations about rebuilding. You know, I think many of us were very concerned with what we saw on January 6th. It was kind of the culmination of a lot of discord that we have in our country and an inability to have civility about our political lives. And so we wanted to have a conversation that was moderated by really skillful thinkers. And we couldn't think of two better people to bring to the table than Nolan, Finley, and Stephen Henderson, who have really kind of made names for themselves as two of the really important thought leaders in our state. They have really, whether you agree with them or not, have very strong opinions, which I think is important. And to kick off our series, we're hoping to also have conversations about how we can build a Black agenda across party lines. As you know, Delta Sigma Theta is a nonpartisan organization. We do not have a relationship with any political party, although as individuals, many of us do. I certainly do. I'm certainly a Democrat. I don't think it's a secret for anybody, but I do have, you know, not to sound like folks who like to say things like, you know, I have Black friends. I do have Republican friends. And I think being able to have conversations with them, even when I disagree with them politically, has really made me a better Democrat in some ways. So we wanted to challenge ourselves to have a really meaningful conversation about how we, not just about how we can be civil, because we know Deltas are always civil, but how we can help to make civility contagious. And so we want to thank Nolan and Stephen for joining us here tonight. Stephen is very familiar with Black Greek letter organization. His beloved mother, late mother, was a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha. So I will acknowledge that. To tease me about my affiliation, but it's all right. It's all good. It's all good. We're all sisters. But you know, I think that just to kind of center, so you guys are just aware of who we are. The Inkster Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta was chartered in 1959, and we serve communities in Western Wayne County. We're part of Delta Sigma Theta, which is actually the largest organization of Black college educated women in the world. We have chapters all over the world, and we have more than 250,000 members. Our members are people like, our members throughout history have been people like Mary McLeod Bethune, Shirley Chisholm, Patricia Roberts Harris, who was the first, right now, in fact, our current HUD Secretary, Marcia Fudge, was a national president of Delta Sigma Theta. And the first person to serve, first Black woman to serve as, actually to ever serve as the Secretary of HUD, the first HUD Secretary ever, was a woman named Patricia Roberts Harris, who was our Executive Director of Delta Sigma Theta. So a lot of Delta heritage in politics. Dorothy Irene Height, if you are familiar with that name, had been our national president at one point too. So we have a deep kind of bench of people who have been very involved in politics throughout the years. And we are very engaged. In fact, you're going to be hearing actions that took place in Georgia, where we are, I'm sorry, I see my internet connection is stable. So I'm going to stop talking and turn the program over to Nolan and Stephen, and then they will take it from here. Thank you so much for joining tonight.
Thank you, Kim.
And I also want to acknowledge my committee co-chair, Karen Braxton, who knows a little bit about running for office as well as a judge in the Wayne County Circuit Court. And she is one of our new members of Delta. So we're very happy to have her as a leader in this role. And I thank all of you, because we often say that social action is sometimes the loneliest committee in Delta Sigma Theta. So we thank you for joining us tonight so we don't feel lonely. All right, with that, I'm going to turn things over to Nolan and Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. So welcome everybody. I'm Lynn Galadner. I sort of facilitate and coordinate the Civility project, and we're going to jump into a conversation with Nolan and Stephen. We want this to be interactive. So normally we ask people to put questions in the chat and I sort of throw them into the conversation as we go, but we're a small group. So if you'd like to chime in, why don't we do the raise hand action at the bottom of the screen? So then we can just have everybody's voice in there. And we'll get started in just a moment. I just want to share a quick little video from our sponsor. Delta Dental has been very generous in supporting the Civility project last year and this year. We just actually welcomed our second sponsor, TCF. And so we're very grateful that they make this possible free of charge to hosting organizations and to people who are attending. So I'll just sort of play this quickly, and thank you to both of our sponsors.
We are living in challenging times. Politics is polarizing. Racism is rampant. The pandemic is frightening, and families are divided. Tough times require more dialogue and more understanding. But navigating our differences constructively is hard work. Delta Dental believes that healthy, smart, vibrant communities are also civil and harmonious. They are places where disagreement does not have to be toxic or destructive. Civility starts with listening. Welcome to the Civility Project.
So thank you. Stephen and Nolan, I'd love for you to jump in and share a little bit about what the Civility Project is and how it came to be, and then we can jump in and have a wider conversation. One of the things that we're hoping to do tonight is to have some breakout group discussion. We may not need that because we do have a small attendance here, and that way I think we could maybe even just have the conversations in the group, so we'll see how that goes. But Stephen and Nolan, could you please introduce the Civility Project?
You're on mute, Steve.
There we go. Why don't you go ahead and start, since I can't even figure out the computer here.
Okay. Well, first, thanks for having us in. It's good to be with groups who are interested in this subject and see the need for civil engagement and civil conversations across the political divides. There's too many people out there who don't think this is a valuable exercise to talk with each other and to try to build collaborative relationships across our differences. And it has led to some very bad things in our country over the last few years. And one of the things it's led to is a whole lot of hate. And our intention with the Civility project is to bring down the hate and to encourage people to talk to each other in a civil manner, a productive manner, not necessarily always a quiet manner, but to have difficult conversations in a very productive way, and in a way that sort of builds friendships rather than destroys them. We've all heard over the last couple of years, oh gosh, I can't talk to this person in my family anymore, or I can't talk to this old friend anymore because they're just so far gone on one side or the other. And we think that's a dangerous place, because if we're not talking about each other, we're not we're not understanding each other. If we don't understand each other, it's easy to dehumanize each other and to hate. So Steve and I, this project grew out of a friendship we developed many years ago, 12, 13 years ago, when we first started working together. And Steve was the editorial page editor of the Free Press and a liberal, progressive. I am now, and was then, editorial page of the conservative Detroit News. And so we had many occasions to sit opposite each other and, sort of battle it out on the issues of the day. And a lot of people like to watch that. And, they like to stay, so they put us together in situations and watch us fight. And we discovered after a little bit of that rather than being sort of bitter enemies because of our political views, that process of productive conversation and discussion led us to a very close friendship. And it was something a lot of folks didn't understand, and a lot of folks didn't appreciate either. A lot of folks didn't approve of that. That we had become friends and had learned to talk to each other despite our differences. And so we thought it'd be a good idea, I'd say a half a dozen years ago, to bring our mutual friend, or not our mutual friends, but our individual friends, the people we associate, together in social settings. We did it with bourbon nights, several bourbon nights over the years, in which we brought together people who normally wouldn't be together, particularly in these days, wouldn't be together, and just asked them to talk with each other and to get to know each other as people before they decided they hated each other because of their politics. And so we found that to be a very successful and rewarding enterprise to do it that way. And, that led to this more formal Civility project. We started on Mackinac Island with the more formal project. And 3 or 4 years ago, we did our first Civility project for the Michigan region, or the Detroit Regional Chamber on Mackinac Island, in which we asked people to raise their hands and say, I'm willing to talk to someone I'm very different from politically, and try to figure out in an honest way what makes that person tick, not to fight, but to gain an understanding for what makes one person a conservative, one person a liberal. And, we got some very surprising results out of those exercises. And, so, last year we decided to do it on a more formal basis, and Delta Dental, thanks for their sponsorship, made it possible. And, it's an exercise that we did ourselves a couple of years ago when StoryCorps was in town.
Yeah. So the thing that I think is one of the keys for this project is, and is really important to understand, is this is not an effort to quote unquote get along. This is not an effort to downplay differences. If you've seen Nolan and I on television, or heard us on the radio, or been in a place where we're on a panel, that there are no holds barred when we disagree. I mean, we really do disagree, and we disagree passionately. Sometimes we disagree angrily. Sometimes it gets right up to that boiling point. But behind all of that, there is this respect for one another, and a relationship that goes beyond those arguments or those differences, that allows those arguments to take place. I think there's kind of a false assumption that that in order to get along, you got to get along, and you got to get along all the time. In fact, I think because you're able to build a relationship with somebody and make it about more than the sum of your differences, you're able to not get along. You're able to not sit politely and discuss something, but really get into those disagreements. And has taken us some time. It wasn't always that way. I mean, I think both of us really early on had a real mutual respect for one another, and that made it possible to build this. But it took time and effort to really get to the place where that was true. And Nolan referenced StoryCorps, which is the NPR program that goes around the country collecting American stories. They came to Detroit, I think it was in 2017. Most people for StoryCorps take, someone they're close to down and tell the story of that relationship. They take their spouse or they take a family member. But I remember thinking, well, I want to go down there and I'm going to take Nolan with me. And what I want us to do when we're there is to talk not just about our differences, not have an argument, but talk about where we get the things we believe. What is it that makes me a liberal or a progressive? What are the experiences that I had that led me to believe that those are the right principles to use to solve problems, to make the world better? And I did that, and then Nolan did the same thing. He talked about what leads him to the belief, that the mistaken belief, of course, but that's all good. He can be wrong. The belief that conservatism is the way to solve problems. And we'd been friends for about 10 years when we went and had this conversation. But both of us, I think, learned things about the other that we didn't know before. I think we saw commonalities in our backgrounds that we didn't understand existed before, which I think is another really important thing to understand, that just because somebody sees the world differently than you do now doesn't mean that they don't have similar experiences to you in some cases. And then the other thing that came out of it, of course, was a different level of respect for where the other person is coming from. I mean, we already had respect for one another, but I think we argue differently now, and maybe can lean even more into the argument because we're more certain of who we're dealing with. We're more certain of the motivations that person has. And we're not making any assumptions that would lead us to believe that person is ill-intentioned or evil or anything like that. And I think the possibility to create those kinds of relationships across political difference is everywhere, but we aren't encouraged to pursue it. We really live in a culture that says, don't bother. They're wrong. They're evil. I'm not going to deal with those people, quote unquote. But think of the people in your world, in your workplace, or in your neighborhood, your community, in your church, in your school, the people you interact with all the time. There's the potential to have that kind of spirited disagreement, but mutual respect that I think is at the heart of what we are calling civility. I know that's a term that gets used in a lot of different ways, and some of them are pretty cynical. What we're talking about is the ability to build relationships in the world where you operate, that respect differences, respect profound differences, and don't ask you to give up your position or your differences in order to get along.
And I think a lot of people, Steve, will say, I have friends who are Democrats. I have friends who are Republicans. I have friends who are black or white or whatever, differences we choose. And, and they are friends. When you go to ball games together, maybe go out to dinner, have a drink, whatever. But we maintain those friendships by not talking about certain things, by avoiding conversations that should be had. And the process Steve described that what we went through um, in StoryCorps is the first step in the Civility Project, getting together and building that foundation of trust and that understanding of where a person is coming from, why they think the things they are, and understanding that they're different than you for a reason. And that those differences don't, as Steve said, don't make them evil, don't make them stupid. And too often we look at somebody and say, that person voted for this candidate, and so I know everything I need to know about that person. He or she is this, that, or the other thing. And so we operate on stereotypes, we operate on assumptions, and not on a real understanding of who that person is. So that first step, building an understanding, building respect, learning about each other before you move to difficult conversation is very important, because once you have that understanding, you can have the harder conversation. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Doesn't mean you won't get to a point where you need to walk away and cool off. But at least you have committed to a deeper understanding and are willing to put the effort in. And there's value in this. I mean, before it works, you have to decide there is value in this, because if we bunker up, if we only have friends and close relationships with the people who are just exactly like us, politically or however, it's very limiting, and we're not going to get much done. We've got to talk across those lines if we're going to collaborate, if we're going to fix the many problems we need to fix at all levels of society, in government and out of government. We've got to talk and we've got to collaborate, and we have to understand each other. And there's value in it, and you have to see that there's value in it before you can make it work.
So that's a great introduction. I really appreciate it, you guys. And I think in a minute, it would be worthwhile to go into a breakout room and have that conversation in small groups about what motivates your political opinions. How do you come to those decisions? What experiences lead you to vote in a certain way? So let's think about that. There's a question in the chat that I want to put before you so we can answer that. I also want to let everybody know that I put the link to the StoryCorps interview with Stephen and Nolan in the chat. So if you want to save that for later, that is definitely an option. So the question that Tori asked is there more civility on the local or the national level? And then why or why not?
I haven't seen civility at any level. Certainly, not in our state level. We've got a situation where we've been given this big old boondoggle money from the federal government. We can't even agree to spend money. And when politicians can't agree to spend money and come together on that, somebody else's money particularly, we're in a world of hurt. So I don't see much civility at any level. And I don't see, even outside of politics, I don't see much civility amongst us as a people. I think we make choices every day to stay divided, to avoid the other side, if you will. So I don't see much civility or much engagement.
Yeah, I don't either. And I think there's some things that are driving it that are important to note. One of them is that the world is changing in terms of who has power and voice, who did not before. We are actually, I think, in the middle of a pretty significant cultural transition in this country. That is a move toward a kind of pluralism that most of us are completely unfamiliar with. And that makes it difficult, I think, because there's fear involved in that change. There's anger involved in that change. And those things make it harder to be civil. But the other thing that I think is worth noting is that the tools we use to have the arguments or the debates that we're having lend themselves to incivility. I mean, they've grown up around a culture of incivility that rewards that kind of behavior and punishes people who act differently. And here I'm talking a lot about social media, which I think is a wonderful sort of transportive development in our culture in terms of the way that we can communicate, but is also full of at this point a kind of incivility that just gets cheered all over the place. I talk all the time about the power of the blocking feature, the unfriend, the block on social media, which is in and of itself a rather uncivil tool, but of course when it gets used, no one keeps it to themselves that they've unfriended somebody. They got to announce it. I'm not talking to that person anymore. I'm never going to interact with that person anymore. And you get more likes if you do that. Get more retweets. These are the things that I think are making it really difficult to deal with the cultural changes that again have really significant implications for how we deal with each other, how we interact. The expectations all look different today than they did just 5 or 6 years ago, and we aren't keeping up with the ability to do that without coming to virtual blows over the differences.
So I've actually been asked to stay in the main room because we have a flood of questions, which is great to everybody. It's wonderful. So let's just go in order. So Cheryl asked, what are some tips for engaging someone who thinks different from you? Perfect question for you guys.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's what the Civility Project is all about. We talked about that first step. Second step is set an honest goal for the conversation. Leave your smugness, your self-righteousness at the door and sit down across from that other person with the honest goal of wanting to learn something about that person, to want to gain a greater sense of understanding, to want to hash out ideas in a stimulating, passionate way. Whatever your goals are, set honest goals, but avoid the goals of, I want to win this conversation. I want to really stomp on that other person and destroy his or her argument. A conversation is not a competition. So set an honest goal for what you want to get out of it and decide what the value of that conversation will be. If you're setting out to convert, you think you're so right, you want to bring that other person into the light and into your own way of thinking, probably don't bother, because people don't like to be preached to. And it is possible to change minds over the course of a conversation, and that's a good thing. But if you're setting out to, with a goal, I'm going to make that person think just like me, it's not going to work. Open yourself up to learning something from the other person as well, and to honestly consider their views and their ideas. And, to get there, you've got to listen. And I'll let Steve talk about that.
Yeah, listening is, of course, I think one of the foundations of civil discourse, and we talk about it as one of the kind of pillars of the type of civility that we're talking about. But I think we also use that word a little differently than most of us use it, in our day-to-day lives. I think many times we think if we're not talking, that means we're listening. If I'm letting you talk instead of running my mouth, then I'm listening to you. But how many times when you're doing that, Are you still in your own head? Are you thinking about what you'll say as soon as that other person stops talking? Or how often are you judging what that person is saying, judging it harshly and thinking that doesn't make any sense? The listening that we're talking about is about an investment, really, in that other person and their ideas. It is really trying to figure out, what is this person trying to say? And beyond that, why does this person believe that? What is it that brings that person to that view? When you're listening for that, I think you are trying to build more of an actual genuine exchange with that person, as opposed to just kind of shouting back and forth. And look, I'm as guilty of not doing that often as anybody. Sometimes when Nolan's talking, I'm like, I wish he'd shut up so I could talk again. And so you have to check yourself. And I have two ways that I do that internally. One is when somebody else is done talking, I ask myself, could I repeat back, what they just said? Not word for word, but could I capture the spirit and the essence of what they were trying to say, in a faithful way, and re-articulate what they were trying to say. The second test I have for myself is, do I have questions about what that person just said? I think if you're really listening to somebody, you generate a list of questions about what they're saying that you want to know more about, or maybe you don't quite understand. Tell me how you can have these two different ideas work together in your argument. If I can do that, then I know I'm listening. If I'm not doing either of those things, I think I gotta kind of check myself and say, I'm not really invested in the exchange here. I'm invested in a contest of arguments and maybe winning an argument as opposed to learning something from the interaction.
So seriously, amazing questions here. I'm loving this group and I hope we can get them all in. Also, one person had asked, can we expand this just beyond the political? So there are many other kinds of differences that often make it difficult to connect. So let's try to keep that in mind as we're going forward. So Kim asked a question. She said, can you talk about how to not stereotype someone's political views when they embrace stereotypes? For example, if someone wears a red MAGA hat, aren't they attempting to send a message? What do you say to people who have never engaged in political stereotyping until the Trump era, but reluctantly do so now?
I would say in any situation, in anyone you encounter, if you want to, if you feel like, well, there's no hope there, I'm just going to avoid that person because I think I know everything I need to know about them based on how they're presenting, based on what they're wearing. You probably should walk past. But if you think, I want to know why they feel that way, I want to know what's going on inside of them, it's worth engaging. I think most people want to talk about this, want to engage. They just don't know how to do it. And maybe that person in the red hat wants to know more about you. You don't know until you take the chance.
So I actually think, I think Nolan's right about what he's talking about, but I do think there's a particular challenge right now, which is driven by the last 4 years of, a political leader who was not interested in actual exchange, not interested in actual argument or policy discussion, but who based a lot of his own approach on, just kind of tweaking the other side. And getting the other side riled up, and that is really difficult to deal with. And I would say, look, if you're dealing with somebody who is trying to do that, maybe that's not the place to try to have the deeper conversation. Maybe that's not the place to try to have, the kind of exchanges we're talking about. But let's go back to the MAGA hats in particular. There are a lot of different people who wear those hats. Now, there are the people who are, devout followers of Donald Trump and who want to just get at the other side, who are there's this really wonderful piece that my friend Alec McGillis wrote in, I think it was the New Yorker or the Republic, right before the election in 2016, about what a lot of the people who supported Donald Trump actually wanted. Like what was it that they were trying to achieve? And for a lot of them, it wasn't about something that they wanted for themselves. They had very few expectations that they would get things. They were focused on what he would do to prevent the other side from getting what it wants, right? They were invested in the idea of denying other people things that they wanted. And I think, look, there isn't a good way to have a conversation with somebody whose motivation is that. If you're focused on holding me out of whatever it is you think I shouldn't have, I'm not sure we have much to talk about. But there are a lot of other, there's far more people who voted for Donald Trump and who wore those hats than just those folks. And I've always tried to get at, okay, make America great again. Tell me what you mean by that. Tell me where it is in the point in history you think we ought to go back to, where things were so much better than they are now. And tell me why. Tell me why you think that. Why you think that was a better era than this. And then I can tell you why, likely for me and people who look like me, that wasn't a better era. And I think there's a lot of people who wore those hats and said those things who hadn't really thought about that, who were not necessarily trying to deny me or people who look like me anything, but really did aspire to this admittedly false but important notion of prosperity, former prosperity, of former success. And I think you can make some headway with folks like that by pointing out how uneven the success of this country was in the past, and how unfair it was to people who didn't fit a very narrow demographic. Again, it's not possible with everybody, but it is also not impossible with everybody. And I think the hat projects something that it's easy just to react to and say, well, you got that hat on, we can't talk about that. But I think that's not universal. It's not universally true. And you've got to push beyond that instinct in yourself to paint with such a broad brush. And
we are in an era when a lot of people aren't voting for candidates, they're voting against a candidate. And so you can't make broad assumptions about everybody who voted for Trump or everybody who voted for Biden, because a lot of people were voting against the other person. I can't tell you how many emails and conversation I have with people say, well, I couldn't abide him, I couldn't stand him, but I didn't want the other guy to get in. And it was true 4 years ago. A lot of people, voted for Trump because they couldn't vote for Hillary Clinton. And a lot of folks voted for Hillary Clinton who couldn't vote for Donald Trump. It's been a while since, we've been really wild about a candidate, and everybody's marching off to support a candidate they're just very, very passionate about. They're voting defensively. I think Steve got to that a little, rather than, out of great support for the name on the ballot. And people have different reasons for making the choices they make. And that's why having these conversations are important. But we're also in Now, a winner take all era, this era that I'm going to get in, I'm going to get the office, and I'm going to get the Congress or whatever, and I'm going to impose my will on everybody else. And, it's our time to get those things we couldn't get when things were split or when the other side were in charge. And I think that leads to a lot of division. I think it did and a lot of bitterness. I think it did during the Trump era. I think it is again now. This idea that instead of trying to find a center where we can please a maximum number of people with a policy, it's all about, man, we got the power now. We may not have it in 2 years. Let's go full steam.
So we have a question about Ron Weiser's comments recently. How do we move beyond? He apologized. So what do you recommend in order to move forward?
Well, so, a few years ago, I wrote a whole column about how Republican lawmakers ought to be rounded up and sewn into burlap sacks with rabid animals and tossed into the straits up at Mackinac. So
I heard about that.
So I know a little bit of what Ron Weiser is experiencing in terms of backlash. Now, look, there's some differences. This is an office holder, an elected official, who absolutely should not be speaking that way about other elected officials. We also live in a slightly different time when when people are threatening the life of our governor or showing up at the Capitol with guns. So it's not a direct parallel, but I do think that part of the obligation here is to figure out, okay, well, what's the way forward, and more importantly than what's the way forward, I think we should be having a conversation about what's the accountability that we need to and can bring to the situation, right? It's great that he said he was sorry. And frankly, I didn't think his apology was as insincere as a lot of people did. I mean, a lot of people dumped on it and thought it was just, him brushing it off. I thought it was fairly sincere. But is that enough? I think the conversation we should be having is, what would accountability for that actually look like? And we don't do that. We don't, we don't have that conversation in our politics, right? Partially because the two sides don't talk to each other. What would it look like to have Ron Weiser sit down with the people he called witches, and have a conversation about their differences? What made him say that? How did they feel?
Moderate, wouldn't we, Steve? We could
moderate that. That's right. Those are the kind of things that I actually think we should be focusing on. How do we get to that level of accountability? Short of that, it just ends up being, it just ends up going back and forth, right? The next time, it'll happen again, and somebody will just say, well, I'm sorry. Now, when I said what I said about Republican legislators, the Speaker of the House and Senate Majority Leader were all on my back about, you need to apologize, and where's your apology? And then 5 days later, I wrote them a note that said, it was a joke. Everybody knows that was a joke, because I would never be able to find enough burlap to do what I was talking about, which was my smart ass way of not being accountable. But I recognize that wasn't appropriate. I mean, I was a columnist. Columnists can do things like that, and I think there's great literary license that allows that. But with our elected officials, we should be saying, how can you be accountable? Don't just say you're sorry. Show that you're sorry. Show that that you can connect with the person that you did harm to, in a way that makes up for this. And we just are nowhere close to that kind of thing right now.
But it is a reflection of what I talked about before, this turning politics into a war, where you remember a time, Steve, and I remember a time, many of the people probably on our screen do, when folks could go into the political arena and the policy-making forums and have very passionate and sometimes bitter exchanges and disagreements, and then walk out at that night and go to dinner together. It's become so personal, and the constituencies expect it to be that personal. And, I don't envy Ron Weiser his job and the task he has in trying to wrest this party away from the Trumpsters who hold control of it now, or, believe they do. And he's, I talked to him when he took the job, and I said, I asked him, how on earth are you going to deal with some of these folks who are just so rabid and so intolerant of any views? And he was pretty convinced, well, we can work through and we can work around them. And he can't. I mean, the witches part of that comment was what everybody focused on. I was as concerned as a conservative, as somebody who has leaned Republican over the years, with the comments he made about Upton and Meyer and the comments the crowd were making. How do we get rid of these two incumbent Republicans? And I would have liked Ron to say, because they're moderate, I would have liked Ron to say, look, we're within a few votes nationally of retaking the House. We're not going to do it if we eat our own. We're not going to do it if we're so intolerant we can't abide a congressperson who doesn't vote 100% with the Trump agenda. If that's going to be our standard going into 2022, we're not going to win Congress back. We're probably going to lose seats. Why on earth were they focusing on two seats held by good men, moderates, and if you get some rabid right-winger primarying them and winning, they have no chance of holding those seats. So why Republicans would be so embittered and focused on taking out two of their own is beyond me. And that's where, I felt Ron Weiser let me down in that regard, is not standing up and saying, look, those two aren't our problems. We can tolerate moderation. And there used to be a time when you had moderate Democrats, moderate Republicans, you had liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats. And that sort of helped the policy-making process. Everything didn't pass on a 100% partisan party line vote. And you had better policy-making when that was true.
So, before 2016, or when that election happened, it seemed like it brought out or gave license to perspectives or meanness or just really, dysfunction that lurked beneath the surface but was not accepted widely. And so we have a question, the level of civility has decreased rapidly during the last administration. So how do we recover as a nation? So we're talking about our legislators, our leaders, our politicians, but a lot of this was simmering beneath the surface in communities and in, everyday folks. And then the politicians have given it permission to come out. So we have a bigger problem than just the legislators.
Well, we certainly do. We can't pretend, oh, well, that started with Trump, and so it'll end with Trump. I mean, you ask George W. Bush, and he probably has a different perspective of, times were different when he was in office. I mean, we have been moving toward this point for a long time, and it's going to take a long time to move back because we treat every damn election as the most important election in our lifetime. And if our person doesn't win, everything's going to go to hell. And, as long as we have that attitude, I don't think we're going to move it.
There's also a dynamic in our politics now that I think is really dangerous. Well, two, in fact, that we can do something about. One is who's in charge. Politicians have too much control over the system in which they serve. They decide the rules by which the bodies in which they serve are gonna abide. In most states still, they get to draw the lines to decide who they want to represent, as opposed to having the people decide who they want to represent them or how they want to be represented. Now, thank God here in Michigan, in 2018, we voted to get rid of that. And, we've got this new system that takes it away from politicians and tries to make it bipartisan. We'll see how that works out. I can guarantee it won't be perfect the first time, but what it will be is citizen driven, right? It will be about what people want rather than what politicians want. To the extent that we allow that to happen, that is what makes for such extreme representation, especially in Congress. And if you look at the way they try to draw districts, it's a competition between the center of a party and the extreme of a party. Is almost never a competition between the parties. And we know that most voters, most people don't live in those extremes. Most people live closer to the middle. It doesn't mean everybody's a moderate, but it does mean, most voters are pretty open-minded about things and can be persuaded, based on the issue to think differently. Our politics don't reflect that at all. The other thing that I'm all worked up these days about are the extent to which minority rule is still inculcated in our systems of government. And we, historically, there's some really awful reasons that those existed, but they present as obnoxiously today as possible. It should not be possible without the majority of the vote to do some of the really sweeping things that the Republican Party in particular, because it is the minority party now, has been able to do in the last 20 years. I mean, it's criminal, in fact. You should not be able to lose the popular presidential election and then stack the bench with judges who will be there for the next 3 generations. That doesn't make any sense. And we have long resisted the conversation about, where all that stuff comes from. But also the fact that the system would be fairer with a different set of rules, and that doesn't mean I'm not somebody who thinks my side should have all the control, right? I mean, we live in a pluralist nation, and there needs to be a check on the majority so that it doesn't run roughshod over minority interests. But we have it upside down to the extent that, and the Republican Party is been very wily and very focused on exploiting those provisions to its advantage in a way that I think really calls that stuff out. And that doesn't mean that they're the only party that's ever done that. I mean, you go back in history, lots of parties have done that, but that's who's doing it now, and that's making it worse. I mean, it does raise the stakes for every election in a way that's super unhealthy.
I don't know how much of that I agree with, if anything, Steve. I do know that we've got a 50-50 divided Senate right now, and which should mean a tempering in the policy making and more collaboration in the policy making. Instead, what we're getting is huge sweeping changes being passed through with a 50-50 vote and a vice presidential tiebreaker. So I don't know how much of that I agree with, other than the part that it seems like if we just keep doing the same things the same way, we're not going to make much progress here. This is time for a jolt to the system. And I think there are some very reasonable things we can consider, including a national popular vote. I think had we had a national popular vote in this last election, the outcome could have never been challenged in the way it was, or never been in doubt. I mean, 7 million votes is a pretty good margin. But I also think we've got to break the duopoly, the political duopoly we've had in this country. I don't think we should allow the two political parties, Republicans and Democrats, to hold such an unbreakable franchise on our politics. I would like to see some changes, including some good experiments with ranked voting. I also think I would like to see candidates go on the ballot without a party designation and see how that works. And, I think it's time to wrest control of politics away from these two parties and give a broader range of voices a chance in America. Because as you said, these parties are dragged around by their extremes, and that's not where most people live.
So we have 3 questions left that I hope we can get to.
Okay.
Tika said, she mentioned social media and technology and the impact that it's had on civility or incivility. And she says, do you believe that this spread of biased and or fake or inaccurate news on social media platforms has had a huge impact on the ability of the different political parties to practice civility towards one another? So social media, technology, biased, fake news, have at it.
Yeah, well, I mean, social media is the progenitor of the very idea of fake news. I mean, it's digital technology that made it possible to not just tell a lie, but tell a lie that spreads around the world in an instant, and then becomes really difficult to knock down. I'm really hard on social media, and I think that it's a real cancer right now, especially on our dialogue. But I also am enough of a student of history to give it a little bit of a break. I mean, every new form of communication in our history, at least, has caused major turmoil, and in some cases, some really tragic things to happen. The telegraph, when it was invented, was used to spread lies about the end of slavery, and to whip up sentiment in southern states before the Civil War. Television and radio in their infancy were manipulated by people, and used to manipulate people. But if you think of over time what those technologies grew into, they were all not just productive, but really vital parts of our culture. Can you imagine what the world would be like without television news? And maybe I should separate cable news, which is a new iteration that's got its own problems, from just the history of television news. But social media is gonna mature. They all do, and ultimately, I think it will prove itself of more value than harm. But right now, it's hard to make that argument. I mean, it's hard to argue that it's made things better. It is too simple in an instant medium to lie and to propagate lies and to manipulate people with lies, and there's too many people who see that as the darling potential of social media.
I mean, I think it could get worse, way worse before it improves. I think the potential for outside interests to use those platforms to manipulate our elections, the potential for the tech companies to put their thumb on the scale in elections. The technology has gotten way out in front of our understanding of the potential it has for harm, and way out ahead of our policy making on it. It is right now, I think, Facebook, Twitter, the other social media platforms are the most powerful force in our politics today. And I'm not sure it's made us better. There's no hierarchy of credibility on the internet. Somebody could Google something and there's a column or a broadcast by Steve, and right underneath it is a nonsensical blog from Bob in the basement. And they're laying there right together. And it's up to the user to decide the hierarchy of credibility, who you can trust and who you can't. And too often today, people are making bad decisions on who you can trust and who you can't.
So Patrice said during the last presidential administration, she attended a dinner in which a US congressperson, was the keynote speaker. The congressperson shared that behind closed doors, Republicans were disgusted with and embarrassed by the former president, yet in public, they continued to support him. At what point in our quest to maintain civility do we acknowledge that some people have only desire to maintain civility with us to the extent to which it benefits them?
Yeah, so, I mean, we have a real problem, and, Nolan can speak to this better than I can because, he sits on that side of the political spectrum, but we have a real problem in the Republican Party right now. And it's exactly what you're talking about, which is, the inability, the lack of moral character that should lead people to stand up and say, look, yeah, I'm a Republican and I believe in the principles of this party, but this is nowhere near it. This is something else entirely, and it's dangerous and it's counterproductive. And as an American, I can't support that. That is something that is always really difficult to do, and I think it's a key part of civility. I think applying the strictures of accountability to your own side is a really important part of being able to have an honest and civil dialogue with the other side. I use this example a lot, but everyone who's part of this discussion today remembers Kwame Kilpatrick and the trouble that he got himself into when he was mayor. And look, I'm a Detroiter. I'm an African-American Detroiter. I'm an African-American male Detroiter. I've known Kwame Kilpatrick and his family since I was born. It was one of the hardest things I ever had to do was to say, this is not okay. Like, this is out of control and you got to go. If you're going to behave this way. It wasn't something I wanted to do. It was something I will, I think, forever have, a pit in my stomach about doing. But it was the right thing to do. It was the right thing to do as a Detroiter. As all of those things that I am, it was the right thing to do. And you have to be able to recognize that. And it makes me sad that I don't see Republicans or enough Republicans willing to do the same thing in the last 4 years, where the case against the person who was in charge was way more obvious and way more egregious than anything that Kwame Kilpatrick ever did. I mean, good gracious. He was an angel compared to Donald Trump. So until we can get to a space where that's, more part of the political landscape, it makes it hard. It makes it hard to have civil discussions. But Nolan, you're a Republican. See how I did that?
And of course, I see things a little differently, a lot differently. I don't think the problem is owned by the Republicans only. I think we have an across the board problem with our politics today and our politicians today is that they don't feel any sort of obligation to represent us. And representing us and our interests, the people who live in their districts and elect them, is not their first priority or their first sense of obligation. I can't tell you how many people have come into my office and looking for an endorsement, sit across to me and say, I'm going to go down there and I'm going to represent the people of Detroit or the people of Birmingham or of downriver, and I'm not going to be party first. And every single one of them goes down there and is party first. They may not agree with the leadership of their party, but they lack any sort of courage to express that. Because if they do, they end up with an office and down by the boiler room in the basement of the Capitol, or they end up on a committee, sort of exploring wildflowers in the West or something. All of their power is derived from the loyalty they show to their political leaders. And it doesn't matter if that person is Donald Trump or Nancy Pelosi. All of their obligation, all of their first instinct is to please the party leaders. And we are now too much about political parties and partisanship than we are about true representation of the people. And that's, again, why I think we have to break the duopoly we have here and give other voices a chance at gaining political power in this country. You shouldn't have to sell your soul to the Republican or Democratic Party to represent the people of this country. And that's what's happened. That's the first requirement for getting in office.
So this is a great example of like the kind of disagreements Nolan and I have. So, I mean, he's right about 90% of what he just said, but he's absolutely wrong about the idea that this is an equal problem on both sides. There is no political, cultural, or social equivalent to Donald Trump in the Democratic Party. And there hasn't been in my memory.
Of course not, but the instincts are the same in terms of
They are.
party first. And I am not going to speak out against party leadership, or I'm not going to put my career on the line to take a chance of speaking out for the people. You don't see anybody doing that. Last person I saw do that was Justin Amash, and where is he today?
Well, that's a good point.
So I think to close, one of the things that we could end on, we've talked about the dire straits that we're facing and the quandary that we all have in terms of where do we go from here. But I'm going to go out on a limb here and assume that because you guys created the Civility Project, you have a fair amount of optimism that civility is possible and that it is actually an achievable goal to reach across the aisle, reach across differences and opinions, and build some kind of understanding, maybe toward a better future. So maybe we end on some thoughts in that direction.
Well, we've seen it work. I talk about the time Steve and I were at the Republican convention, state convention on Mackinac Island, and you're standing at the bar after the sessions, we're having a drink, we're talking, like we always do. And I walk away and these two Republican women jump on me and say, "Oh, you're over there talking with Steve Henderson. How could you talk to him? He's so awful. We hate him." And I'm like, "You hate Steve? You know Steve?" "No, we never met Steve." I said, "Well, you can't know that you hate him until you spend a little time with him." I said, "My space is empty. Go over there and talk to him." They talked to him for an hour or more. And I don't know what was said. I walked away and what have you. But afterwards, they ran into me and they said, "Oh, we just love him. He's so wonderful." I'm like, nothing about Steve changed. What changed was their willingness to engage with him and try to understand him better. And so I think, yeah, once we get over this idea that nothing else matters but politics, I'm very optimistic because we've got some big problems that we're only going to solve together. And that I think the desire to solve them is great. And I think that's going to drive us to work together.
So, I mean, for me, it's not just optimism, it's necessity. It's that the pluralist nature of this country, which is only going to grow, right? This is only going to become more of a pluralistic nation, demands that we be able to understand people who are different from us, who think differently, and who want something different. And I think for too many of us, the idea is that, well, we'll just crush that other side, right? We'll just eliminate the idea of them ever having power. And that's just not realistic. It won't work that way. We do have to figure out a way to be different and to think differently and to respect those differences, and at the same time be able to talk across those differences to solve problems. I don't know how else it can work. And what we saw in Washington on January 6th, should scare everybody, no matter what political stripe you are, about what lies ahead if we don't learn to do that, if we don't get some of these people who have now decided that they'd rather overthrow the country than live under the rule of the other party. If we don't get some of that under control, some of it in line, we're all in so much trouble. And again, I think it begins not at the national level, not at the sort of big picture level. It begins with these individual interactions that we have with each other, the places that we all live and work and play, where there are people who are different, and whom we can know better and understand better, and come to a space where we're not talking about them as though they're evil, or believing that they're evil. We have to do that. Otherwise, there's nothing inevitable about this republic. I mean, lots of countries go away even after 240 some years. We got to work at that. We have to work to preserve it. And this is one of the most basic, to me, foundations of doing that, is learning to talk to each other.
Thanks, you guys. I really appreciate that. Way to end, although a little dire, Stephen, but yes, it's, optimism, but you're right.
I'm just the realist in this partnership.
I'd love to hand it over to Kim for some final words and really thank Delta Sigma Theta for sponsoring this tonight. It's been really wonderful to be with you. So Kim, let's hear from you.
Lynn, thank you so much for moderating. That was such an amazing conversation and exactly what I think we all expected, really smart conversation about a really important issue. So I want to thank Nolan and Stephen for spending an hour with the Inkster Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta. It's going to be the first in a few conversations we're having about rebuilding our democracy. The next conversation, as I mentioned, will be about building a Black agenda across party lines. So let's just start that work right now. We all know good Republicans. Let's try to bring some of them to the table.
Do we really, Kim? Do we really know good Republicans?
We need a whole lot more. We need a whole lot more Black Republicans, I think.
That's true. That's true. We want to bring them to the table and have a full conversation. And people from other parties, as Nolan's point just a little while ago, that this duopoly, I mean, maybe it is time for us to challenge it. So we will, whoever is willing to come, we'll bring them to talk about building an African-American agenda at the beginning of this new presidential term. If I could just ask those of you who are able to turn on your cameras, I really would love for you to just share a little love with our speakers so that they know. I understand the temptation to turn off your cameras. I have mine off half of the day, but I know it's the end of the day. I know some of you are cooking. I know some of you are maybe doing homework with your children, but I just want them to know that you have heard what they had to say. I hope that this won't be the end of this conversation. I hope we'll continue to have it within our organization. We have people on the line who are not members of our chapter or not members of Delta Sigma Theta, but just wanted to be part of this conversation. And if we could just give some applause. I always feel so goofy doing that, but I want to make sure you guys know we truly
Thank you all.
Thank you guys.
Spending
Time with us and having this conversation.
Been a lot of fun. Good questions.
Great questions.
Jump in before we end. I want to tell everybody that we are booking more civility sessions. So if you have a community group, a church, an organization, a workplace where you think this would be beneficial, please let me know. I'll put my email in the chat, but you can also go to GreatLakesCivilityProject.com, and I'm booking now for May and beyond. So we'd love to add you to the list. So please let me know.
And in
Thank you.
closing, I just want to say, I always joke that the Social Action Committee, not just our chapter, but every chapter in Delta, a lot of times ends up feeling like the loneliest committee in the chapter. So if I could just get my Social Action Committee members to, in the reactions, put a little heart on your screen so everyone can know you have a heart for social action. I want to thank the committee for your leadership and work on this project and others. We'll be doing more activities. We also are planning our annual expungement fair that we do. It's even more important now because there is new legislation that will make it easier for those who have a record to have their record expunged, and that obviously is a path to economic mobility for a lot of people. So with that, Lynn, thank you so much for your moderation. Thank you, Stephen and Nolan, and thank you all for attending. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.